Hi everyone, it's Kristi, and in this video I want to talk to you a little bit about the things that characterize some of the worst and stupidest comments that show up in my patriarchy video comment section, and give you a little bit about my perspective on them, and if you want to engage at all or how to handle them or how to interpret them, then I'm going to go through about 4 points of where that typify how people respond and why it's stupid, and then I'll sum it up by going over Thunderfoots' comments to my first video and explain how his comments have all of the hallmarks of error that I'm going to walk through in the first 4 stages here. The first characteristic that just indicates a person is dumb is they start a comment off with an insult, or that's all they do in their comments. They just write an insult directed at me or something, how I look or how I sound or what I'm doing in my video. And if you start your comment with an insult, all it shows is that you have nothing intellectual to say. You are signaling to me that literacy is wasted on you, and I don't actually have to bother with anything I read beyond that insult because it's not worth my time. Because how can I respect someone who starts off a comment to a complete stranger by insulting them? So yeah, I see those and I basically just move on because there's nothing in that comment worth responding to. I would also say that if you find a comment where someone starts off with an insult and then tries to engage with you on a comment, don't do it. Don't ignore the insult and engage with them anyway. Any more than if someone walked up to you in a bar and slapped your face and then wanted to sit around and have a chat with you. There's no way you would let them get away with that. So I would say if someone insults you, just say, look, if you're going to insult me, we're stopping this right now. Because if you can't treat me with respect, then I have no reason to continue this conversation. Another thing that characterizes some of the comments on the patriarchy videos is whining about the definition of patriarchy I use. Now the reason why these people are whining about the definition is because in the videos where I present evidence that men overwhelmingly hold power, the definition of patriarchy fits. So rather than actually admitting that the empirical world is best described by the concept of patriarchy when it comes to political power, economic power, social power, they want to argue that my definition is somehow not valid. So the one thing that they'll do is they'll just say your definition of patriarchy is wrong, but then not provide a sourced, external, credible definition that is appropriate for the social world, that shows that my data somehow would match that definition. And they also just make up bullshit definitions on the fly that have no basis in reality. Now, it's not just patriarchy that I've seen people do this in the comment section. Another typical one is objecting to the concept of egalitarianism and saying, feminists think that egalitarianism is about equality of outcomes, not equality of opportunity. Like, well, that's bullshit. Find me some definition that says that egalitarianism is that, or, so it's not enough for you to just make up bullshit and me to take you seriously. If you want to raise a serious objection about my definition of patriarchy, then you need to get a definition that's not made up out of your ass. You have to actually do work and type words in Google and then read the results and think about them, and then look at the data from the Pew Center and look to see whether or not the data are best described by the concept of patriarchy or egalitarianism before you make your point. Because otherwise, if all you do is object to my use of patriarchy and I scan through it and I don't see a link or a reference or a source or any other alternative scholarly work that's not just you talking shit, again, I move on because that has no basis in reality. And I don't care what you think, only what you can demonstrate. So if you can't demonstrate it, go away. Third, they often avoid dealing with the data that I put in the video at all. The Pew Center data, for instance, in the first one, nobody raised any objections that Pew is somehow a biased source or somehow the numbers counting up how many men and women in Congress and the Senate was not accurate. They can't win when they argue from the data. So a lot of times what they'll do is try to change the subject by bringing in something that has nothing to do with the definition of patriarchy that I've mentioned. Or they'll bring up things that they'll say are counterexamples to the data, but they don't provide sources, they don't provide studies, they just make empty assertions. And so the problem with this is, if you go to a conference, if you're a real academic and you go to a conference and somebody presents their work, you have to engage with the work that they have brought to the table. You have to talk about the definitions they're using, and if you want to bring in some other ones, then you have to be able to give sources. If you want to talk about the data quality or alternative sources of data, then you have to do that in the context of their talk. But you can't switch from talking about politics to saying man-spreading is somehow evidence of a matriarchy. You just, like, that shows you're full of shit and you don't know what you're talking about, and or you can't deal with the data that's been presented. So avoiding the data or trying to change the topic by providing, well, claiming that data exists that says X but without actually citing it is another typical dumb shit comment that I see on these videos quite often. And the last sort of characteristic comment that I want to describe are the people who, well, the anti-feminists don't seem to have a consistent position. They either say patriarchy doesn't exist without demonstrating it in any meaningful way, without defining it and then looking at data. They just go, oh, doesn't exist. Just like people who are creationists deny carbon dating is accurate. Just faith-based worldview kind of stuff. Or they'll say, well, if the patriarchy exists, then it's women's fault because they haven't done anything to fix it yet. It's like, well, if you're admitting that patriarchy doesn't exist, then why are you running away from the data? You know, why aren't you presenting evidence to support your claims? And if you do think it exists, but it's women's fault, if you're saying patriarchy exists and men hold power over women, how is it women's fault that they have not yet wrestled away power from men that men aren't giving up? So it's just bullshit, because I think a lot of these people don't really think things through. They don't actually take the time to hear the arguments because they have a faith-based worldview about what they think the world is, rather than having an evidence-led worldview, which is what my series is all about. Finally, I'm going to go over Thunderfoots' comments from my first video and point out the errors that he makes. He writes, I have an even better example of patriarchy, in quotes, where women are forbidden from competing with men. It's a global organization called the Olympics. For some reason, patriarchy has ensured that women cannot run as fast or jump as high as men. Must be cultural norms. After all, it can't be biological differences, because if it was biological differences, you would have to accept that brain function is part of biology. This is what I would call a non sequitur. Let's break down what he does. He says, I have an even better example of patriarchy, without defining what he means by patriarchy. And he's not referencing my definition of patriarchy in the video. And my definition of patriarchy looked at the ways that men hold positions of power in the political, social, and economic sphere. So let's see what his even better example of patriarchy is. Women are forbidden from competing with men in a global organization called the Olympics. This has nothing to do with the definition of patriarchy I gave. And he's not offering another alternative definition of patriarchy where this makes sense. What he's basically doing is moving the goalposts from the social world over to the physical world in order to establish that there are sex differences, which I agree, that they exist clearly, and that men and women have different advantages based on our sexual differences. But that doesn't have anything to do with what I was talking about in the video. It doesn't have anything to do with the data from the Pew Center. He's basically gone completely off course because he can't win with the data that I've presented or the definition that I've been citing. So he has to redefine the narrative to change what patriarchy means, to reinvent it as somehow dealing with biological differences, which the concept of patriarchy doesn't. In my response, I bring this up, and I'll just read what's here on the screen. I have to say, as you are a fellow scientist, I am disappointed at your deliberate misunderstanding of the theory, your misoperationalization of the key concepts into measures, and using the wrong data to test the influence of patriarchal norms on social power relations. You are misrepresenting the theory I presented. Why? If you want to read the full exchange, I then go on to explain to him why the Olympics is not a good example for the reasons I just gave you, so I'm not going to do it again. In his response to me, because he can't win on the facts, and because he realizes he can't win on the definition of patriarchy that's accurate in the world, he instead turns to insult me. Because again, he doesn't have anything intellectual to offer on this topic. Actually, you're not a fellow scientist. Your publication record shows as much. You might reasonably claim to be a pseudoscientist, but you are certainly no scientist. So let's see how your non-scientific mind approaches this problem. It assumes differences in gender representation has nothing to do with biology when it clearly does. Even when an idiot-proof example of when biology plays a role is put in front of you, the Olympics, you just prove you can be a better class of idiot. Normally I wouldn't say something like this, but seeing as you spent the first 10 minutes or so waxing on about how clever you are, etc., only then to make a comically bad argument for patriarchy, maybe you should leave science to the scientists. He doesn't present an alternative definition of patriarchy from the one that I'm using. He doesn't explain why the data that I used in terms of political power as represented, operationalized in terms of men and women's participation in the US Congress since 1917 is invalid. Instead of using real evidence or real concepts, he just insults me because he can't win on the facts. And in these situations, what some people do is rise to the bait because they feel emotionally attacked. But the fact is, the data are the data. The definitions are the definitions. He can call me a non-scientist all day long. It doesn't change the fact that the data that I presented are best described by the concept of patriarchy. And his frustration with that comes out as personal insults. Well, you can insult me, again, all day long, but it doesn't change reality. So if you want to have a faith-based view of things and make up lies about what I said in my video, because I never assumed that differences in gender representation had nothing to do with biology. That's a lie he made up. I also don't accept that he never explained why the Olympics example is even relevant when we're looking at social power in terms of economics, social relations, and political power, legal status. He doesn't make that connection. So it's really just the frustrations of somebody who doesn't want to admit that patriarchy is a real thing. And he's acting, instead of like a professional, he's having a temper tantrum. And that's really sad to see, because as an academic, I think it's our job to model good behavior as to what it's like when we go to academic conferences. And when you go to academic conferences, people don't insult each other this way. People don't bring up non sequiturs and try to divert a conversation away from what the person presenting has already talked about. And so, you know, this is just, to me, a symptom of his lack of professionalism. If he can't do it as a model for his fans, then it's really no wonder that the people who came over from his channel, who watched less than 2 minutes of my video, end up basically mimicking his behavior. It's really sad to see, and I think he could do better. I think he should do better. I think our discipline, the scientific discipline, demands that he be a better role model than this. So this has just been a little extra bonus video. We're going to have facepalm moments of the week tomorrow, unless my schedule is crazy, in which case it might be moved to Wednesday. So this is your late breaking news that facepalm moments of the week might come out on Wednesday. Other than that, I think all that's left to say, and you know it, come on, say it with me. I've been Kristi. No, you haven't. I've been Kristi. I gotcha. I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. We'll see each other soon. Thanks for watching all the way to the end.